You're listening to the best of the bravest. Interviews with the FDNY's elite. The last show of the month of July, the month and the year by extension is really flying by. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 197 of the Mike to New Haven podcast, the best of the bravest, volume 22, interviews with the FDNY's elite. If you haven't checked out episode 196, that was volume 25, the milestone volume of Tales from the Boom Room, profiles of the NYPD's arson, explosion, and bomb squad, and that was with Mike Garcia. Mike Garcia was in the emergency service unit prior. He worked in Truck 3 in the Bronx. He was also in the Navy. And after 9 years in ESU, he went over to the bomb squad in 2008 and stayed there through 2017. He talked about a lot of different jobs in the bomb squad, and the late Greg Abate, a bomb man and an E-man himself, who died much too soon at the age of 45 back in 2013 of a heart attack. Greg worked the Times Square incident in 2010. He did a great job there, and that show went out to him and his memory. So for volume 22, the best of the bravest, we welcome my next guest, who served for 25 years in New York City EMS, both pre and post merger with the FDNY in 1996, and we'll talk about that as we go, of course. He was certified as a paramedic in 1978 and steadily worked his way, through the ranks of EMS. He came to be a part of cool divisions like the Special Operations Division, as well as the Inspection Services Unit, and he penned the New York City Emergency Medical Action Plan. He was an eventual staff chief upon EMS's merger with the FDNY, and he played a pivotal role in the responses, at least in the EMS end, to both World Trade Center attacks in 1993 and 2001, and the crash of American Airlines Flight 587 2 months after 9/11 in November of 2001. And that, for volume 22, the best of the bravest, interviews with the FDNY's elite, is one Zach Goldfarb. Welcome, Zach. How are you?
Mike, good evening. Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you. No, yeah, it's right. You were on the show before. I should mention you're a returning guest because originally, I forget which volume it was for, volume 19 of Tales from the Boom Room, with Don Sadawi, Chief Lou Anamone, Hank Millay of Rescue One, and yourself. We did a show in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. So go check that out. It was a longer show. It was about 2 hours, but it was good. A lot of good information in there. And you were great then, and I'm sure you'll be great tonight. So your childhood's interesting because you were really exposed, as you were telling me off air just now, to emergency response, really, while you were still in diapers. So why don't you tell us about that? First, where you grew up and that experience.
Sure. So I was born in 1958. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, in an area that has gone through a lot of evolution and is now doing pretty well from what I hear. It wasn't necessarily that way when I was growing up there, but as a very young child, I was living on Eastern Parkway in Brooklyn, and in December 1960, so I was not quite 2 years old, there was an airplane crash, a mid-air collision over Brooklyn and Staten Island, and two planes crashed to the ground. One landed in Staten Island, and the other in Brooklyn, downtown Brooklyn, 7th Avenue and Sterling Place. And 7th Avenue and Sterling Place was about a half mile from where I lived with my family. So my parents put me in the stroller, and we responded to this plane crash. Unfortunately, a tragic incident with I think over 120 lives were lost in Brooklyn in this crash of a United Airlines jet, but or probably a propeller plane at that point. But that was my first exposure. No, I have no recollection of it, but my parents told me I was there. So
you slapped the red light on the stroller and you went
on the
code
stroller
3 to
and
scene.
off we went. It's been like that ever since.
As we'll discuss tonight, of course, quick shout out to our friends in the chat: Pete Branzo, retired NYPD street crime lieutenant and author; Christian Williams, Maui Swift, Joe Maliga, and Joe Murray. I haven't seen Joe in a while. Former NYPD cop, current criminal defense attorney. Hey, Joe, it's good to see you. We haven't talked in a little bit. So glad to see you here and hope you're doing well. So, I guess that answers the question of, where the passion began. And so going into your career as a first responder, it's a unique journey because some guys are taking all the tests, as I've talked to with my cops and firemen before, and they're waiting to see who calls them. The PD calls them first, the FD calls them first, and they go from there. For you, EMS started not too long after that plane crash, you were telling me, in the early 1970s. So there's a choice there. Were you angling for it, or did you not care where you ended up as long as you were working in the back of an ambulance?
Well, I have to say, I didn't grow up in an emergency service family or an environment like that. But there was something when I was, I guess, a young teenager. I remember a friend of mine and I started going to these Red Cross first aid classes. I'm not quite sure what prompted it. But it may have had something to do with my mom, who had some disabilities, and she was at home. I don't know, but we took at that time what was called standard first aid at the Red Cross, and then advanced first aid, CPR. I think maybe was just coming around at that time. So as a teenager, I took these classes, never having any thought that that would be a career orientation or anything like that. But did have a little bit of exposure to those sorts of things. And, like a scout, right? Be prepared, know what to do in an emergency. That was always my mindset. I always had a flashlight as a kid. And I guess maybe I was a little nerdy, but anyway, I always had that preparedness mindset.
We call that being a buff, and there's no shame in that.
Now we say that, yes. Now we say that.
This is volume 22 of the Best of the Bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. We're joined by retired EMS, both pre and post merger with the FDNY chief, Zach Goldfarb. If you have a question for him in the chat, fire away, and I'll make sure that he sees it. If I don't get to it right away, rest assured I will. So 1977 is your official foray into New York City EMS. Now, this is a time in which, when crime is through the roof, medical runs are through the roof by extension, because people get shot, people get stabbed, they need an ambulance. People get assaulted, same thing. There's drugs on the street, and we have people overdosing. So it's kind of baptism by fire, if you will. Which was the first neighborhood that you were working in, and who was your first partner?
Well, if I could, just a little bit of background before that. So
Sure.
in the 1970s in New York City, the EMS was very young. I had actually just been formed as an entity in 1970. And so the level of service being provided was not yet the top shelf that it grew to be. It was evolving. And in many communities in New York City, volunteer ambulance corps were started by the local communities because the level of service from the city's municipal ambulance service had not yet grown to perfection. So I at that time was living in the Rockaways, and I was 17, 18 years old. I joined a volunteer ambulance corps in Rockaway called the Peninsula Volunteer Ambulance Corps. And I joined really knowing nothing. And the way the volunteer ambulance service worked, they put you through training. I became a state certified emergency medical technician in 1977. And then it became known to us that the city was hiring. They went through this big hiring boom to bring people into EMS as they grew it and made it more professional. So I applied, and the application at that time, nothing was civil service in those fields. So it was simply a paper application, and kind of an interesting story. I did the application kind of a light colored blue pen, and went downtown. I think we had to go somewhere to Worth Street or Broadway or somewhere and deliver the application, did that. And I got a call 2 days later from the hiring manager, who called me and said, "Hey, do you still have that blue pen? Because you didn't sign your application." And I said, "I do." And he said, "If you can come down and sign the application today, you got a job." And at that point, making $9,760 a year was a lot more than I was making. I was working as a janitor in a senior home for adults. So I said, "Sure, I'll take that." So so that was how my career got launched. So in 1977, September, I was hired. And by the end of September, I was working out of Cumberland Hospital. So Cumberland Hospital is in the Fort Greene area of Brooklyn. Now it's a gentrifying, high-end, very nice area. But in those days, and even now in some parts of it, it's a tough part of town. And so that's where I started working for the city. And in those days, so I was hired as an ambulance corpsman, which was sort of a hybrid. The city prior to, or at the time of forming EMS, they had two titles that rode on ambulances. There was a motor vehicle operator, who was responsible for driving the vehicle, getting it to the scene and getting it back to the hospital. And there was an ambulance technician who traditionally had come out of the hospital, and they were responsible for patient care. They were starting to become all EMTs, but they weren't all EMTs at the beginning. So by 76, 77 meant they were all EMTs. So you had the technician and you had the motor vehicle operator. And in 1976 or so, the city started a program to bring these two titles together in a title called ambulance corpsman, who could both drive the ambulance and be the technician, be the EMT. So I was hired as an ambulance corpsman, and the way it worked is I had two partners. One was a motor vehicle operator who made much more money than the other, who was an ambulance technician. The motor vehicle operator made more money than any of us. Good union. So those are my two partners. And interestingly, we go on our first night of work. I was working nights, and we get to the scene of a housing project somewhere down in Fort Greene, and for a shooting upstairs or something. And mind you, I came from the volunteer ambulance service, where we typically had 4 or 5 people on a crew, and with plenty of people, plenty of hands. We took all our equipment upstairs. I got out of the ambulance and was waiting for my partner, the motor vehicle operator, to join me. And he said, "Kid, I don't go upstairs. That's not in my contract." So me with my technician's kit, and we didn't carry oxygen upstairs in those days, but I had my technician's kit, and 18 years old, and well, if I went into the housing project, then this was how life was. We didn't have radios. Of course, we didn't have cell phones. If you needed something from the ambulance or you needed help carrying a patient, you would go to the window and yell out, "Hey, Sal, need a hand?" Or if you were lucky to get to a phone, you could call the dispatcher and have him radio to your partner in the ambulance to bring up whatever you needed. So that was how I started, 1977.
Like I said, it's baptism by fire, because it's funny, a couple of things on that. It's not like you guys were ESU or the fire department, where at least if you're going up the stairs and you're a little winded, you have Scott packs, you can breathe some air. No, you got to bring all that stuff up with you. No benefit of that. Like you said, no radios. And to tell you how shorthanded, for context for the audience, New York City was back then. The audience, you guys are older than I am. You guys remember it better than I do. But back then, I mean, they were cutting corners in the sense that if you were coming into the fire department, more so if you were coming into emergency service on the PD side, they trained you as paramedics. You had to have that training. And the New York City Transit Police even resorted to starting what would eventually become their version of ESU, but was coined at the time the Emergency Medical Rescue Unit, because it was basically a roving car going around in case people were having heart attacks or aneurysms or whatever it was in the subway, and they would go down. And that's because, as you said earlier, New York City EMS, at least at that point, hadn't grown to the ranks and the ambulances that they needed to serve the city effectively.
True, and the response times were nothing like what they are now.
Exactly.
You could wait a long time for an ambulance, and that obviously there were many workarounds put in place because of that.
Now I have to ask you, because they never live on the first floor. Where these runs, were a few of them for people, you probably know what I'm going to mention. The people who, shall we say, are awfully large individuals.
People are large, and the larger they are, of course, the higher they live, and less likelihood that the elevator is working. True.
Yeah. Yes. So that's a test in and of itself. Now, like I said, when I was introducing you, you made your way through the ranks pretty quickly and pretty impressively, and I'll get to some of the cool things that you did along the way. But when you got there, when you're young, you're having fun, maybe you're not thinking about it too much, but was the thought, at least in the back of your mind, as you got a little bit of time under your belt, of moving up the ranks and hitting the books, so to speak?
So I would say not at first, because that, I was a kid, really. I was 18 years old. It was my first real job that actually had money coming in with a steady paycheck and health insurance and stuff like that. And I really didn't see further than, next day, next week, what I was doing at that time. Certainly no vision of what the future could hold. However, in a short order, I saw a posting on a bulletin board within my first few months there that they were looking for applicants for paramedic school. The city was starting a paramedic program. And I thought to myself, that seems pretty cool. And, it's sort of a stereotypical story, but as a sort of mid-range teenager, I used to watch a TV show called Emergency with 2 LA County firefighter paramedics, Johnny Gage and Roy DeSoto, who were, in some sense, my heroes. They were the coolest guys, and they did the coolest stuff. And we would watch them on a Saturday afternoon, and they would, shock a patient to life with those cool paddles and pop the medicine caps off and give intravenous medications to patients. And I was a kid, didn't know anything, but I said that was pretty cool, and went into fires and rescued people from all sorts of scenarios. So when I became involved as an EMT and sort of started to live in that life, I said, wow, this is pretty awesome. So now I see a posting to become a paramedic, and I said, wow, the paramedic is the pinnacle. Now, in those days, the city had really just a couple, and I don't mean like a couple of dozen, I mean a couple of paramedics. There was a first class that was done as a pilot in 1974, and the graduates from that class mostly worked in the Bronx, and I was working in Brooklyn, and there were no paramedics in Brooklyn. So when I went into paramedic school, I was in the third class, the first one being 1974. The second class went into school right around the time I was hired in the fall of 77. And I went into paramedic class in January 78. And so I was in the city's third paramedic class at Albert Einstein College of Medicine. And it was pretty cool to do that. It was very competitive to get in. It was a battery of exams. And that was probably the hardest series of exams I ever took to get into paramedic school, because in those days, essentially, it still is. It's like 2 years of medicine crammed into 6 months of training. And I was blessed. The city's program, paid you to go, paid you to attend. That was your full-time job, was going to paramedic school. So by May of 1978, I was certified as a paramedic, and I've been one ever since. God help me.
But I mean, the key is at least to take the initiative, because some people, they never even get to that point where, I mean, if you take it, obviously it's not good to fail. I mean, it is a little bit disappointing, but some people never even get to that particular stage where they're in the program, they're giving it their all. And at least if you don't pass right away, at least on the first try, you can live with that. As Wayne Gretzky once said, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
True.
So that's very much true.
True. That's, I think, one of my favorite lifetime achievements was actually graduating that program and going to work as a paramedic. So when I came out of paramedic school, I went back to Brooklyn, and my classmates and I started the first paramedic unit in Brooklyn on the evening shift. Up into the class before me started the first paramedic unit on the day shift, and we started the first paramedic unit on the evening shift. So nobody had seen paramedics in Brooklyn. The only thing anybody knew about paramedics was watching Johnny and Roy on TV. So it was a great opportunity for us to grow the program. And obviously, it could have gone badly if we didn't do a good job. But we were really given a great opportunity. We were given an ambulance, and it was a relatively new ambulance, and it was tuned up pretty well. The supervisors didn't monitor our speed, which all the other ambulances, they had graphs, they tracked your speed and when you use your lights. With us, they gave us extra radios, extra lights, and said, basically, we don't care what you do, get to the calls and save some lives. And so that was awesome. And we my colleague paramedics and I think really set a strong record for the city. And the paramedic program continued to grow. At Albert Einstein College of Medicine, they ran up into the teens numbers of classes, and then Bellevue Hospital started to run the classes, and now, of course, it continues. The city FDNY EMS Academy runs those classes, but there's nothing like being the first at something, and it was very special. It was a great opportunity, and to showcase with our colleagues in law enforcement, fire service, and our EMS colleagues who were EMTs, to demonstrate to them what they could grow to achieve, and many did.
And it creates an extra sense of camaraderie. Before I continue, to both Joes in the chat, Maliga and Murray, I see your questions. I'll get to them momentarily. But it creates an extra sense of camaraderie when you're that small, because you're like the little engine that could, and you feel like you're all in it together. And I love that, because, listen, there's no strife, there's no ego, there's no competition. It's, listen, we got to try and survive and prove that we can hang. And that attitude is the best attitude to have, because some of the best work that's probably been done in EMS history was probably done during those infantile stages.
Definitely some great work. And at first we were demonstrating that we could get to these calls faster from across the borough than some of the local ambulances who maybe weren't moving so quickly. It sort of prompted people along. And it really, I think, was a bellwether of improvement of pre-hospital care and emergency medical services in the city.
So Joe Maliga, of course, he asks this question often anytime I get a cop fireman, or in your case, EMS guy on, and it's become a running bit between him and I. Did you ever deliver a baby?
Oh, yes, 8.
8 babies. Okay. You ever meet with them down the road, or never? Just was that one time only? Okay.
No, did not.
Okay. And the second leg of the question, this is a little bit of a lengthier one from Joe Murray, so it comes in 3 parts. He says, Mr. Goldfarb, I had a client who had a history of bank robberies. He told me he got his start, in the 1970s after his son tragically died in a fire in Harlem. He said, quote, the FDNY got the call, but it was just at the change of shift, so they delayed responding. He since said the city let his son die to save money, that he was going to take their money, so on and so forth. Did that really happen during the 1970s city financial crisis, or is he BSing them? Thank you, Joe Murray.
There's a lot of parts to that question, but if you're asking,
Yeah.
do I think, in my opinion, that anybody ever delayed a response to a fire because of a shift change, I would say that never happened. That's what I would say. If I had to answer that question, I would say no.
So in
That
short,
part
Joe Murray.
didn't happen. But it's interesting though what Mr. Murray says is in the mid 70s, 74, 75, the city went through a financial crisis. You might remember the classic headline from the president right before to New York dropped dead.
Yep.
So the city went through a financial crisis and they actually laid off cops and firefighters. Not EMS, as far as I know, because there was nobody here to lay off. We were just starting, but they did lay off cops and firefighters. And then by 76, 77, they were starting to grow these agencies back. They were rehiring folks who had been laid off. And that was the hiring boom that I came in under and others in the years following me. So it's the recovery part.
Joe Murray goes on to say, he said the FDNY was directed not to respond because of overtime. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm not going to take the word of, I'm not saying he's lying. I regret the loss, but I'm not going to take the word of a bank robber over.
Right.
You know, you got to understand my position there, Joe Murray. For those of you that are fans of Police Off the Cuff, Joe's on there often. He's on there with my friend Duty Ron, of course. Catch him. He's always a good, interesting guy to have on. And the question like that is why. So, the Emergency Medical Action Plan. So many things have been written since. We have OEM now in place, and it's been tweaked and modified through the years to make sure that all emergency response in New York City is centralized, because people forget it's not just the NYPD and the FDNY now, or the Port Authority Police, or even the MTA Police. There's so many different sub-agencies that exist on the medical side, on the law enforcement side, even the fire side, that you have to have it under one umbrella. And one of the first steps, at least in the EMS side, that was taken to ensure coherent, centralized response was that medical action plan. So writing it, here you are, certified as a paramedic only about a few years prior. You're a new agency. Like I said, you're in that infantile stage, and it's the best stage because great work is being done. There's an extra vigor there. What went into writing it? What were the key points that you put into it?
Sure. So a little bit of backstory, of course. So as a paramedic and being the only paramedic unit working on our shift in Brooklyn, and then after a little while in the evenings, I went to the night shift, the overnight shift. And again, we were the only paramedic unit on the overnight shift. And what we found was that when there was a major incident or emergency, a fire scene, any kind of a multi-vehicle crash, train wreck, anything like that, the supervisors, the EMS supervisors, would turn to the paramedics at the scene and sort of look to them to take a leadership role. And in managing not just the patients, but in managing the incident. The problem that I had with that was that I had no training to do that. I was trained as a paramedic to take care of sick people, but I was not trained to manage an incident or an emergency. And the OCD in me started kicking in, saying, I have to learn how to do this because you're expecting me to do it. I have to learn. And if the agency is not going to train me, then I have to get some training to do that. So I started on my own, going to outside schools and classes and learning about disaster management, disaster response. What do you do when you come to emergency? At that point in time, a system was being developed, started on the West Coast, called the NIM system, the National Interagency Incident Management System, or as some people call it, NIMS with two eyes. That's sort of a slang term because now we have NIMS with one eye. So that was being developed, and I made some contact with some folks out there, and I got some information from them. Meantime, along the way, I got into a supervisory program in our communications division, and I began to supervise. I was trained as a call taker and a dispatcher, and I was supervising the call takers and dispatchers. And from there, I managed to find my way to the executive level in the agency, because, folks, in those days, everything was political appointment. It was who knew you or got to know you. We were not yet civil service, and the leadership became aware of my background and my interest. And they said, we have a role doing administrative work, rewriting our plans and our policies and procedures. Would you want to be involved in that? So I learned to be opportunistic, and I took that opportunity, went to the day shift and started working on developing plans. And my first mission was develop a disaster plan for our response, because whatever they had was from back in early 1970, and it was sort of prehistoric. So in order to do that, I continued my expanding my knowledge on incident management, what was starting to become called incident command, and these procedures that were being developed on the West Coast. And I took that and brought it into New York City. We were at that time considered a third service agency, meaning you have police and fire, and then EMS was a third service agency. And so we wrote our own procedures for ourselves, how we managed. So I had the opportunity to craft those procedures. I rewrote literally the manual, which we call the EMAP, the Emergency Medical Action Plan. And then I was given the opportunity to teach it to everybody in our agency and to implement it. And that became the ongoing adventure of what I did, because it was awesome. But that's how I got started with that EMAP. And that set of procedures, obviously, it's changed, it's evolved, but it's 35 years later, and it's still being used. And of course, now Incident Command is the national standard, and NIMS with one eye is now, of course, the law of the land. But that's where it started for us.
And of course, there were emergencies over time in New York City and nationally, as we'll discuss as we go, that made them kind of modify it, especially as the decades changed, technology changed, the demographics even of given cities changed, and made them take a thorough look at things. And of course, you were at the forefront of that in the city. A few more shout outs to some of our other friends in the live chat. Don't want you guys to think I forgot about you. Ruth Ann Griffin, of course, always a great supporter of the show. And from the ATF, Nicholas D, he says, Mike just wanted to say your live shows are so underrated. That you're telling me. You ain't kidding, Nicholas. Unsung, unheralded, and underrated I am. So thank you very much, Nicholas, for saying that. I thought I was the only one. I kid, of course. I can hear my mom lecturing me about humility, so I'll stop there. But that said, that brings us to your time in special operations from 83 to 85. Now, we think of special operations usually when we hear it from a police standpoint, a military standpoint, or even the fire department standpoint, with their special operations command that was formed back in 1998. So what did that specifically entail for you? What kind of runs was special operations doing pre-merger EMS?
So what happened was our chief of operations, a gentleman named Robert Becker, was really a person with a lot of vision. And he looked out at the city. And in those days, we were responding to multiple alarm fires and multiple victim collisions and injuries and train derailments. There were a host of train fires that happened in the 1980s. We had many incidents that were multi-casualty incidents. And the rank and file of our line supervision were good at what they did as line supervision, running the ambulance operations, but they didn't have, in general, that kind of training or experience to respond to these incidents. So Chief Becker called upon a couple of folks, Chief Jim McNally, rest in peace, and myself, and said he wanted to start something that he called at first the operations cars. He said, you're going to be an operations car. You work directly for me. You have the authority from my office. And what I want you to do is you respond to anything that's unusual or mass casualty or a special event or anything that's beyond the norm. And you learn how to manage these things. And essentially the direction to us was you learn how to get anywhere in the city fast, learn how to not get stuck in traffic, learn how to take control of these out of control situations, learn how to give direction to folks, and you figure it out, basically, is what he told us. So they allowed us to go to outside training. We took outside courses, and fresh with the incident command system that I had just developed, this was now the opportunity which I was given to teach this to all of our supervisors, and then we would respond to these scenes and take charge, take the lead, teach along the way, show them how to implement this stuff that I had just written and put it in place. And it was a very successful program. Along the way, demonstrated at a number of large disasters or major incidents, because one of the great things, but one of the unique features about working in a city like ours is there's always big stuff going on. Yeah. So you could craft a procedure and say, I think that when this incident happens, we should, put on red shirts, and then give everybody the red shirts. And you're going to have 5 of these incidents by Friday. So you'll have a chance to practice it and say, oh, the red shirts really don't work. We should wear blue shirts. Okay, well, let's try that next week. That's sort of a unique testbed opportunity. Obviously, I'm using a silly example, but let's talk about something else. Like, we're going to try incident command. Let's show everybody how to do it. And now the next time, every time we go to one of these incidents, we're going to use triage tags. We're going to use incident command procedures. We're going to put on incident command vests. We're all going to wear helmets, whatever it might be. And this is what we did. So Jim McNally and I started that off, and that is what became known as the Special Operations. We were the operations cars and became the Special Operations Division, or SOD. What we did was we merged with another part of the EMS agency, which was at that time called Technical Services, and that was our hazardous materials response. So what we were responsible for, the way the city broke out hazardous materials response, was the fire department responded, and they were responsible for mitigating the problem, right? Fixing the problem, stopping the leak, that sort of thing. We were responsible for the patient care part of it. So anybody who was contaminated had to be decontaminated. Oh, there you go. You have some of our cool vehicles there. That was a great picture on the cover when you first put it up. So we had responsibility for gathering those patients, decontaminating them, operating some decontamination vehicles, and providing that type of medical support to these incidents. So that became part of special operations that formed. And then ultimately, as I went up in rank, I was responsible for that operation as well. Also, special operations encompass some other unusual things. For example, we had the ability to set up for special events. So we would put up tents, large tents. We would run generators, create lighting, and essentially run an environment so that we could manage mass casualties. As an example, the New York City Marathon every year, which brings typically hundreds of patients, if not more, depending on the weather, into Central Park, where we support them. And of course, some of them are more seriously injured or sick and need to go to the hospital, and many don't. But that's a major mass casualty incident for us every year, still is. And so setting up that whole operation with tents and lighting and communications, that all came under the branch of special operations. We also dabbled with some technical rescue and some other things, but that was not our forte. Our forte was taking care of patients.
And it's parades too, because think about it. You also get the Halloween parade, New Year's Eve. Sometimes people have a little bit too much to drink, and that's only one aspect of it. Hypothermia kicks in. So there's really always a big event of some sort, even championship parades, like when the Mets won the World Series in 1986 or anything like that. Giants won the Super Bowl in 90. You get incidents like that where even though they're relatively good, positive things on the surface, they do yield a logistical nightmare that if you're not proactive and prepared for, it can be a disaster in more ways than one.
Anytime we bring a crowd together in this city, really in any city, but certainly in New York, we have the potential for problems to happen. And you mentioned Olympic parade in might have been 1985 or so. There was an Olympic parade. They were coming up at one of the classic ticket tape parades. We were saluting our Olympic heroes coming up Broadway, and many people were gathered on a temporary scaffolding for construction that was in front of a building. And as we were standing there watching the people parade up Broadway, the scaffolding collapsed, and 50 people were thrown into the street from this. Just as an example of the many things that happen. And our mission then was not only to take care of them, but you got to clear Broadway because the show must go on. Get them out of the street. Get them out of the street and get that scene moving. So
I imagine somebody coming by with a big broom. Nothing to see here, folks. Carry on.
Exactly.
Show must go on, as you said. This is volume 22 of the Best of the Bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. We're talking with Zach Goldfarb. It's been a great conversation so far. And of course, there is inspectional services. Now, I mentioned those vehicles there, and I'll show it again because it's a great vehicle. And I think this is the special operations vehicle that you guys used, maybe for technical rescue, maybe for hazmat, of course, pre-merge. But inspectional services, did it involve, obviously vehicle maintenance and making sure personnel was maintained? What went into that?
So inspectional services is interesting. So following a couple of years in special operations, my boss, Chief Becker, called me in one day and said, I'm going to promote you and reassign you to inspectional services. I was devastated because I was having the time of my life, literally, in special operations. There was no better job than that. And he said, I want you to take charge of inspectional services. So inspectional services was a unit that was at that time responsible for procedural compliance. Are you following the procedures? The classic stereotypical joke was we would inspect people to see if they were wearing white socks because you're not supposed to. You're supposed to wear black socks. So I said, well, look, if I'm going to take that on, I have to change the whole paradigm of what we're doing with this unit because that's not going to work for me. And by the way, could I please stay in special operations? And the chief, who was my mentor, said, no, you can't. So I went to inspectional services. So what we did was we realigned the activities there to focus on pre-hospital care. So all the folks that were working there, we had them focus specifically. We told them, forget about white socks. That's not important. But what's important is when we get to the scene of the patient, are we doing the right thing for the patient? Are we taking appropriate care? Are we taking vital signs? Are we bringing the right equipment up? Are we managing the patient properly? If they need to be carried or transported in a certain way, are we doing that? And so we shifted our entire focus to focus on the quality of the pre-hospital care that we were providing. And we, I think, made a very big impact on the quality of care and service in the city. That was in 1985.
We have Marianne Pizzatola. She says, "Hey, Chief, she's watching tonight."
Marianne.
So good to see you, Marianne. And my friend Bill Ryan, of course, retired NYPD Arson Explosion Squad detective first grade and the co-creator and co-executive producer of Tales from the Boom Room, profiles of the NYPD's Arson Explosion and Bomb Squad. Thank you guys for tuning in tonight. Steve-O's here too, retired NYPD lieutenant. Come on the show, Steve. Quit hiding from me. So that said, of course, I do want to, before I get to your time as a deputy chief, I don't want to gloss over this because I was talking about this with my buddy John Bushing, who was in the transit police and their emergency medical rescue unit. Getting around back then, and this applied for every emergency response agency. Now, I mean, you get a call, it gets put into the GPS, and you can get there relatively quickly, even if you don't understand the dynamics of the city that well. You know how to get around by having technology at your disposal. Back then, you guys were using maps, weren't you?
Yes, sir. So we had maps. We had these large laminated maps, but more importantly, because of the latitude that we had, we were literally directed in special operations to know our way around the city without being committed to bridges, tunnels, narrow passageways where you're going to get blocked up in traffic. So we learned every back street to get you right to the foot of a bridge or a tunnel, every back way, which way you could traverse. And we really demonstrated, I think, a lot of driving skills in getting through traffic and getting around the city, even when things were tied up. Yes, Waze would have helped a lot in those days, but
or Google Maps.
Google Maps. Yeah.
Yeah. Nah, and that's the fun. I'm only imagining, and that's why I said, earlier, the best work was done during that time period and that's no disrespect to the current crop who is doing great work now, of course. But back then, I mean, Jesus Christ, you're in the ambulance trying to get around. Where are we going, Bob? And I think it's this way, and the map's this big. I mean, that was something. That's the first challenge, just getting there.
Sure. Absolutely. Knowing your way around the city. And after a while, you sort of develop a familiarity with it to know where to go and how to get there.
Yeah, of course, the familiarity helps. The more time you do it, the more repetition,
Exactly.
the better that you get at it over time. So, 1987 to 1990, you were deputy chief of operations, and it's a continuing evolution for you. And you're still such a young guy. You're in your late 20s, early 30s at the time. And then, well, you look good for something. You said you were born in 58. You look good. You don't look it. I give you credit. But, during this point of your career, you're a rising star. And again, you're so young. So being a deputy chief now, it's a larger responsibility because you had command over some divisions. I'll mention the Bronx in a second. Obviously, we talked about special ops and inspectional services. But when you get a large contingent of personnel under you, there's a great aspect of, yes, you have the opportunity to lead and teach, but there's also the negative aspect of, oh man, I have to teach and I have to be responsible for not only my safety, but theirs. So what kind of helped you evolve into that particular role? And what were the keys to making sure you led effectively, but also maintain personnel safety?
One of the things that I learned early on when you're responsible for a unit or supervise a unit, you're responsible for it, whether you're on duty or off, 24/7, 365. You could be on vacation, on a cruise, whatever it is. If something goes wrong, you're responsible. So I learned to depend on the folks that work for me and to prepare them for different types of situations. We routinely had discussions, drills, talked about different types of scenarios. We had some rules that we used, like the no surprise rule, meaning don't let me sleep when there's something going wrong and I should know about it in advance, things like that. And we had really great people. I mean, this agency, which was small, especially in its formative days in the 70s and 80s and 90s, small, tight cadre of people. Most of us knew one another in some way or shape, had crossed paths or had the chance to work together, and really were very focused on doing the right thing for the patient. One of our mantras as we came up in the EMS was, if you have to make a bad decision, make the decision in favor of taking care of your patient, and you'll never be wrong. And that has always stayed with me. It's like, remember what your underlying mission is. Your mission here is always to do the right thing for the patient. And if that means you have to break a rule, bend a rule, do something a little sideways, if you could argue that it was in the best interest of the patient, you'll be fine. And that's what we tried to preach to people. And I think we were pretty successful at it.
There was something Joe Borelli, the former NYPD chief of detectives, told me when he was on the show back in February, where he said, if a guy makes a mistake of the mind, That's one thing, because maybe he had a better understanding of the rules and he went ahead and he did something wrong anyway. I can't live with that. I can live, and I'm paraphrasing him, with a guy that makes a mistake of the heart. He meant well. He was trying to do well, or she meant well. She was trying to do well. They may not have done everything perfectly, but their heart was in the right place. That you can forgive. So
That makes same idea. Same
of
idea.
course,
Remember what your
same.
mission is and stay focused on the mission. And that's really, sort of been the mantra in EMS. EMS has a saying which I think comes from military special operations, which is adapt, improvise, overcome. Because in EMS, you're always challenged. You're always the third service. You never as well resourced as police or fire, almost never as well resourced as our brothers and sister colleagues in police and fire. But we find a way to get it done. Adapt, improvise, overcome, and we get the job done.
Mm-hmm. Marianne says to the point about the maps earlier, Hangstrom maps were issued equipment.
Exactly right.
And Jimmy Scortis says, hey, Jimmy, thank you for watching. Almost anything to benefit the patient's outcome. Very true.
Yes.
Very true. Now, before I get to your time running the Bronx division, of course, this was during the 1980s when we had the AIDS epidemic going on. And now we have a sufficient knowledge of it. There's medication to treat it. And we have an idea of what it is and what it isn't. And the thing that really kind of made it something that was better understood was Magic Johnson coming out and saying that he had it and being as open and candid as he was. But while this was going on and so many people were getting sick and dying from it, working during that time on a humanity level was tough. But what was EMS's role in that? Because I've never gotten your perspective on that time in New York.
We were very busy. We were, regardless of whether one would argue that we were understaffed or under-resourced or whatever it was, we were very busy. Very busy meant, for example, that when you got on your unit at the start of an 8-hour shift, most areas of the city, you were going for the entire shift. There were times when we would be holding calls, we would be backed up. Hot weather like what we had last week, going back in the 1980s, we had a lot of trouble with fleet. Because fleet, obviously, you need money to buy vehicles, to maintain them, etc. And if that's not kept up or maintenance is not maintained, it's hard to keep your fleet running. We were very challenged, and so the AIDS epidemic, the crack epidemic, was a big problem because we had a lot of overdoses. And nowadays we have Narcan, naloxone, which is carried by EMTs. It's carried by cops. It's carried by lay people. Anybody can administer it. That's great. We had that drug then, but only paramedics could use it. So it was not like anybody could walk up to somebody and give them some Narcan. So there were a lot of calls and a lot of overdose calls. The corresponding with crack was crime, and crime was bad. And guns was a big problem in the city. And of course, we seem, unfortunately, to see that coming full cycle back toward that, and which is unfortunate, but not my theme for tonight. But along with crack was crime. And so we had a lot of gun runs, we had a lot of crime, we had a lot of shootings in the city in those days, which the upside of it, if you will, if there's an upside, is our EMS personnel got a lot of experience. We got experience with trauma, we got experience with overdoses and medical calls. And all of that builds to make a better cadre of EMS. But of course, that's not really the way you want to develop your skills if you could avoid that.
And that's what I was going to say. It is unfortunate, but it's so true. If you go to certain places in New York, certain places really anywhere in the country, some of the best hospitals in terms of trauma, some of the best EMS workers, some of the best paramedics, EMTs you will find work in areas like that. Because what did I say earlier? You do it so much eventually, and unfortunately, it becomes second nature.
Yeah. The other thing about AIDS that sticks in my mind is that one of our first line of duty deaths in New York City EMS was a paramedic, Tracy Allen Lee, from Harlem, who got stuck by a needle and died of AIDS. And it was causative proof, went through a hard time proving that, but eventually did succeed. But a terrible loss, and she was a great paramedic. So
she died young.
Yes.
She died very young. She was like 32, 33. She died back in 1997, right after the merge. And, looking at her, reading her story, and I'm sure she was an even more beautiful person. What a beautiful woman she was, too. Like, she must have been great to be around, I imagine.
So I never had the privilege of working directly with her, but I knew her. I knew who she was. But any EMS professional and anybody to die in the line of duty is terrible. And when it's something that could be avoided, that you think that could have potentially been avoided, it would have been much better.
Of course, of course. Jimmy Scortis mentions as well, we became subject matter experts just due to the volume of calls we handled. That's true, Jimmy. That's
Yep.
true. But you guys did great, great work. And that brings us, I guess, to the Bronx. And Steven Sislavsky, you mentioned how did you respond to the first Trade Center bombing? For those of you that did not see Zach on the first time he was on this show, go back and watch. This was back in February. Volume 19 of Tales from the Boom Room, Profiles of the NYPD's Bomb Squad. He was on, he discusses in depth, because that's what that particular show was on, the 93 Trade Center bombing, if you want to see what he did there. But you were in the Bronx, and talking to people, I have family in the Bronx, and talking to people in general from there, they kind of feel there's a grittiness there because they feel like the forgotten borough, that people only pay attention to us because we have the Yankees and that's it, and to an extent, that was pretty true back then. And there was so much going on. And really, so much of the crime, the really violent crime, at least back then, was happening in those rough and tumble areas of the Bronx. It was a war zone to work there back then. And here you are, a borough commander. Were the calls, maybe this is just narrative and you can pop a bubble in that tonight, were the calls as even more voluminous than other boroughs? Was it really as bad as it was made out to be back then?
Well, let me first start off by telling you about my introduction to the Bronx, because I think it's is another one of those hallmark events in my career. So I was informed that I was getting promoted to Bronx Borough Commander, and I was going to be assigned to the Bronx. And this came at a meeting on a Friday afternoon in February of 1990. And so being again, my OCD, I said, okay, great. And that Friday night, although my promotion didn't really take effect until the following Monday, that Friday night I went out to my stations in the Bronx, my new stations, and started introducing myself. So at 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night, I'm roaming around the Bronx, meeting supervisors, meeting the medics and the EMTs in the Bronx, and just introducing myself and saying, you've heard, I'll be here on Monday. Just wanted to say hello and see what's going on. Previously in my career, I had been mostly in Brooklyn and in headquarters. And so I had not had really a lot of exposure into the Bronx. I mean, I was aware of it. Obviously, I had done some time there, here and there on incidents, but hadn't spent a lot of time. So I tried to orient myself. Went home. That was Friday night, Saturday morning. Sunday morning at 3 a.m., we got a call for a fire in a disco, in an after-hours club in the Bronx, and that was the Happy Land Disco fire. And I happened to be on call that weekend, of course, so I get the call and I respond to the Happy Land Disco fire in the borough that does not yet belong to me, but will be mine on Monday morning. And we had, of course, 87 fatalities at that fire. So by the time I got to the Bronx on Monday morning, I had a team of quite traumatized people, because that was a terrible, terrible, bad event. And so this is what I inherited. My first challenge is, what do we do in terms of providing counseling services, making sure we have support, being concerned for our members who just came through this horrible trauma. And in fact, it was ongoing, because we had identifications going on. We had units standing by at a school where families were coming to view photos of trying to make identifications. We had funerals were starting. It was just an ongoing event. So that was my first entry into the Bronx as a borough commander. Bronx, in response to your question, the Bronx was a uniquely challenged borough, because we essentially at that time had 3 large ambulance stations, and we're covering a very, not just large geographically, but complex, because the Bronx is hilly, it has terrain, it has places where you can't get from here to there because there's a hill of 200 feet in between, right? So it's a challenging area to get around quickly. And so the response time was always difficult in the Bronx, and it seemed like the more units you put into the Bronx, you're still putting them into the 3 stations. You still only have a fixed set of hospitals, and you're never in the right place to get to something quickly. So I think even today in 2022, response time is still a challenge in the Bronx. I know they have tactical response groups that go there every day and augment the resources that are there. But of course, we have many more stations now in the Bronx. We didn't have that when I took it over. So we had 3 main stations. We had a couple of small stations that we called outposts, and we did the best we could with our deployment model and the resources that we had. It was a challenging place, and gritty. It was gritty. So in the Bronx, in the fire service, in FDNY, we talk about the war years, and the war years were the late 70s, period of time in the late 70s when they say the Bronx was burning. And the Bronx was burning. And what became known, of course, as the South Bronx, that community, was fire after fire, night after night. There was a tremendous amount of fire service activity in response to that. And the Bronx, of course, developed a terrible reputation, undeserved, as a Bronx is a great place. I love the Bronx. I was there for 6 years, then I was back as deputy chief for a couple of years after we went over to FDNY. And great people, great place, had some tremendous experiences there. But I think it doesn't get the positive reflection in the rest of the city that other boroughs do, unfortunately.
No, you're absolutely right about that. Before I get to, I guess,
And go Yankees. I'm sorry. Go
no,
Yankees.
of course, go Yankees. They won last night after they
Yes.
dropped the ball against the Mets.
That
Those
is
two
small.
games. Small little bump in the road, but hopefully we'll get him back next month. But that said, before I get to the evolution there, Joe Murray did have an interesting question to chat about citywide emergencies and mobilization. I don't know if you went down there, but when the riots happened in Washington Heights and Crown Heights in 91, 92,
I was both.
You were at both? Okay, so tell me about that.
Which one?
Both of them. Wherever you want to start.
Different in different circumstances. Similarities in terms of both involved large groups of people that were unruly or disorderly or creating problems.
Mm-hmm.
Different because of the motivation of the groups and sort of what inspired the Crown Heights riots, of course, coming from the killing, unfortunate killing of a young child by a motorcade, and then stabbing of a Hasidic Jewish man. The Washington Heights riots. Right now, I can't even remember what started that, but it was a different.
It was a narcotics detective, and I know him, Mike O'Keefe. He was chasing a drug dealer named Kiko Garcia. Kiko fired at him. Mike fired back and killed Kiko. They made it out to be that Kiko was executed wrongfully. He wasn't. Yeah. Evidence exonerated Mike, but the narrative came before the truth, and that's how that riot got started.
Thank you. The problem with these types of civil disturbances is keeping our people safe, frankly, because we're there, of course, to help people, right? We're there to treat people who are injured or sick or injured in the course of the riot, or who are just sick or injured in the community, and we have to get through whatever the disturbance is in order to take care of them. So that's always the challenge for an EMS agency during any kind of civil disturbance, and to try and keep the peace. And unfortunately, sometimes you have uniformed personnel, EMS uniforms, come into a setting, and people link us metaphorically with law enforcement or whatever it is that they're feeling a disturbance against, or a figure of authority, and they want to take out their hostility on us as well. So really the challenge, and this is the challenge of every EMS leader and every public safety leader, every shift, is get your people home safely that night. So it just becomes a little harder when you're going into a civil disturbance scenario.
So real quick, before I get to an interesting experience, not even in New York City in 1994, after 93, just to quickly gloss over that bombing of the Trade Center, we talked about constantly amending the manual, constantly amending the method of attack, and making sure that response was good and coherent. You get a large-scale emergency like that will be dwarfed 8 years later, and we'll talk about that in a little bit too. Just briefly on that, tell me about EMS, kind of, if they had to, rewriting either, officially or not officially, the method of response to large-scale emergencies.
So, part of our doctrine is when we respond to a major event, we have a review process. We call it an after-action review, or an AAR. And we go back and look at and to see what happened, what was accomplished, what went well, where are we strong, where are our opportunities to improve, and then what do we have to do to fix it or to get there. And, we've had experiences, for example, during a period of days of civil disturbance, where we would review our activities after a particular day's activity and say, all right, let's modify for tomorrow. Let's try a different tactic, or let's stage in a different place, or let's respond in a different profile to try and improve our process. So these books are, if you will, constantly, they're living documents. They're constantly being revised and updated. I'm sure that goes on now as well. And this is the way we're always continuously improving performance or operation. I think every emergency service does that, or certainly should.
Yeah, it's better to be proactive than reactive, and that was definitely the case for EMS, even before the 93 bombing, and certainly afterwards, always being ready, always being on alert. So 94, Woodstock 1 was in 1969. And 25 years later, to the anniversary, they did Woodstock 94. Now, there was a disaster that was Woodstock 1999, but this one was actually pretty good. It ended up being a fun weekend, a little bit of rain, but it wasn't a bad weekend at all. It was a good festival. So tell me about.
Depends on your perspective.
Well, compared to 99, it was wonderful.
Yes.
So that's why I say that. So tell me about how you got the chance to partake in that.
So 1994, I was the bar commander in the Bronx, and we became aware that there was going to be this concert in upstate New York, and I liked good music, and I liked the environment and the atmosphere. And so I tried to involve myself in the operation. And what I mean by that is I communicated with the folks that were planning the event, Woodstock. And I said, listen, I have some vacation time. I can take leave from the city. I'm a paramedic. I'm a chief officer, special operations background. I have a lot of experience planning for and managing these events. I'd like to offer my services to you. Right. And essentially I was rebuffed. And they said, thanks very much. If you want to work as a line paramedic, we'll be happy to have you as a volunteer paramedic in the mud. That's fine. But we don't need any leadership or anything like that. So, thanks very much, but no thank you. So I said, all right, guess that's not going to happen. I'll watch the movie afterwards, right? A couple of weeks before Woodstock, I had contact with a gentleman who worked for the State Department of Health who said, we're going to need some help monitoring our health department permit. The State Health Department in New York issues a permit when you have a mass gathering over 5,000 people that stipulates that you're meeting the medical need requirements for the people that are there. So they said, we're going to look for some help to monitor that permit. Would you be interested in coming to help us? And I said, sure, happy to do that. Because if we get me to the music, I would be happy. I don't have to work or get my hands dirty. Just keep an eye on things, no problem. So I went up there a couple of days before the concert started. I'm on vacation. I relaxed from the city work, and I check in up at Woodstock. I'm going to be staying in a trailer there. And they introduced me to the Hired Guns, a private company that was hired to manage EMS for Woodstock. So I got to spend about 12 hours riding around with the leaders of that organization. And that night we had a meeting, myself and Ray Flora, a colleague of mine, paramedic school colleague who was running the ambulance service at the time, Rockland Paramedics. I just recently retired. And they were the contract ambulance service and the state health department. And the state health department official said, so what do you think? And I said, you're going to have a real problem. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, these folks really have no idea what they're in for. They have no organization. Their entire workforce is volunteer. They don't have communication set up. They don't have any idea about incident management. And this is going to collapse as soon as something happens here. And they said to Ray Florida, what do you suggest we do? And Ray said, I think you should put Zach in charge. So they asked me if I would do that. And I made one of probably the hallmark mistakes of my career, because I didn't say, sure, here's a contract, just pay me this much and I'll be happy to do that. But instead I just said, sure. So with no pay and no charge, I said, I need you to give me all the resources that they have, put that at my disposal, and I'll organize it. So what then became our process over the next 18 hours was we brought everybody together who had any kind of supervisory background, read through resumes, built a communication center, organized teams and divisions and groups, implemented incident command, gave people assignments, and created an EMS system for Woodstock. And so we went through a number of challenges in 1994. We had rain, we had mud. It was very much like the first Woodstock. We had porta sand surfing when they were sliding the porta sands down the hills. We had literally 3 days of caked up mud and no bathrooms. And it was a very interesting environment. And we ran our EMS operation through that with a workforce of about 400 volunteers, which whittled down to about 150 by the time we were done. And I should say it shredded down to about 150, but we got the job done. We had 5,500 patients in 5 days there. And, for that week, it was the third largest city in New York State. It was just Woodstock. And fortunately, I think we had very, very little loss of life. We were successful. We had a medevac operation, and it was absolutely an extraordinary experience. And our team, everybody did well. And we left there feeling very proud of what we did. Woodstock 94.
To your point on the mud, there was for those of you in the audience, you may remember the band Primus. They were huge in the 90s and the early aughts, but especially the 90s. and they have a song called "My Name Is Mud," literally. And so as they were performing "My Name Is Mud," the audience literally started chucking mud at them on the stage. And if you go on YouTube, you can watch that set in its entirety. The band, of course, is Primus, Primus. Great, great, interesting. One of those really unique '90s bands. So that brings us to 1996. With that merger with the FDNY, we were talking about it off the air. That's when your vehicles of NYC EMS became, as I'll show momentarily, these vehicles, FDNY EMS ambulances, which they still have to this day, though not in this form. This is the retro vehicles. The vehicles are much newer now.
Sure.
But that said, this was the time of mergers because Mayor Giuliani succeeded in getting his police merger of 1995. He consolidated the housing police and transit police into the NYPD. Now he wants to go for EMS next. Now, I don't know if that had always been discussed. I don't know if it was always so clear that you were going to be merged with the FDNY. There was some discussion about the NYPD taking it over. 95 into that merge in 96, that last year. What was the discussion going on? And were you guys pro or anti-merge?
Well, when you say you guys, I don't know if you mean this guy or
New York City EMS at the time, yourself.
The general feeling was opposed to that because you're talking about you're taking folks who are independent agency, independent-minded, third service agency, and perceptually at least sublimating them to another larger agency. So obviously you have a feeling of loss of autonomy and loss of self-regulation and control. And so nobody really felt good about that. And there were a lot of concerns about what the underlying intent was and what would happen. The rumors always get spawned in this kind of an environment and what's going to happen and who's going to get laid off and how we're going to be subrogated to people who don't know anything about running EMS. And this wasn't helped by some of the attitudes on the fire side who really didn't want any part of EMS. The attitude of, we came here to fight fires. We don't want to go to these medical emergencies. We don't want that to be part of us. So there was a lot of friction feelings on both sides, which led to what some people call the hostile takeover, or something that was perceived by some as a hostile takeover. As a chief officer, first of all, my responsibility is to lead the organization through this process that our superiors say this is the process. So you're either on the train or under it, as they say. And so the chief officer's attitude was largely we were part of an organization, the Superior Officers Association, had determined that we were going to be supportive of this process. We were going to help to facilitate, smooth the rough spots, try and make the thing work as well as we could. Of course, first we want to make sure our patients are getting taken care of and our troops are getting taken care of. But I think we realized intellectually that we would not have any measure of success if all we did was fight and throw obstacles along the way. So the leaders in the organization, I think, were in general supportive of this and worked toward making that process work well. It was not an easy time. It was definitely not an easy time. And there were any sorts of issues that were thrown from various different sides of the equation, but ultimately, I think FDNY has done a great job with EMS. I mean, I think EMS is resourced now, and I've been retired for 19 years, but the EMS has resources now that I think it might never have had if not for the merger. And I think that EMS is now recognized as a full-fledged partner in the process. So maybe it took a little while for that to get there, but I think at the end of the day, it was to the benefit of the patient and to the benefit of the EMS provider. And I hope really that they'll just adjust the salaries appropriately. That's really the big sticking point, I think, and justifiably so, is that EMS providers need to be paid properly, and they're not, which is a whole nother, I'm not going to launch on that agenda, but that's an important issue for the listener to hear.
No, and you're absolutely right about that. And the interesting thing, and I'll ask him about it in a few weeks when he comes on, is you guys had Dan Nigro during that first year there as the chief of EMS. Now, this wasn't an easy assignment for him either, and he talked about it when he was on my Friends Getting Salty podcast, and check that out if you haven't yet, because Commissioner Nigro was great in that interview, where it was morale for him too. Here were these guys that, like you were just saying, they had their own agency, they had their own style of doing things. Now they've been absorbed, and there's so much anxiety there. And the first question isn't even how you're going to dispense personnel to medical cause and creating EMS stations. It's making sure we're all on the same page and in lockstep and in harmony. So working with him during that first year before he went to become, I think, chief of operations, what was he like to be under?
Yeah, Chief Nigro is a very intelligent individual and has a very good sense of people, and so he's a good leader in terms of leading people, understanding what is motivating, what's driving people. And I think he applied those skills. He had a super challenging responsibility because I know that he had pushback from the fire side who didn't want any part of this, and he had pushback from the EMS side that he had just inherited. And so he had to create or formulate an organization that's going to work in a setting that had not worked before. There were difficulties. For example, there were some great ideas about stationing ambulances in fire stations because they'd be closer deployed in the community. The kind of thing that sounds great on paper. If you're starting zero-based blank state, I think we should put a station here and let's call it a fire EMS station or an EMS fire station, and everybody will work together and life will be great. Well, that's nice in theory. A lot of problems doing that, and a lot of problems doing it blank slate, but even more problems doing it when you have these existing workforces that are thrust together and don't want to be living together and work differently in different, completely different methods of operation. So those are the kind of challenges. And Chief Nigro and I never actually had a conversation about how he felt about that sort of thing, but I can imagine that because he's a very sharp individual, I can imagine that he had many nights of difficult sleep because of those situations.
That first year is often the hardest year, 96 to 97. I'm sure it's looked back on with some degree of fondness now. Again, the same thing we talked about earlier, the little engine that could, but back then it certainly wasn't viewed that way when you're in it. I think now you have perspective all these years later. It's easier to look back on, but not when you're in the middle of the fight, so to speak. So we talked about tests through the show. We talked about Happy Land, the 93 Trade Center bombing, everything that, the AIDS and crack epidemic, everything that was happening during that stage of your career, different stages of your career, I should say, even Woodstock. All that, I guess, prepared you for what would come in 2001 with 9/11. So getting down there, and this would come at a devastating cost for EMS particularly. There were 2 men from EMS that didn't return home that day. When did you get down there, and what was the plan of action?
So 9/11. I think that has to be a separate podcast. I don't know, but I'll see if I can give you the highlights. So 9/11 for me, started the night before. I was assigned. The way that chief officers were assigned is every 6 or 8 weeks or so, you did a rotation, a week of overnight shifts to provide overnight supervisory coverage. So I happened to be my week of overnight shifts, and we had started. We had started on Saturday night, I think was the start of our week. And the exciting part of our week was Monday, I was supposed to get a new car. So chief officers had cars assigned to them, and it was very unusual to get a new car, and I was getting a brand new car. I was pretty excited about that. And my aide, Mary Merced, and I started our shift that Saturday night. And for some reason, I said, we're going to spend the next couple of days inspecting our mass casualty apparatus. You had a picture of one of them earlier, our major emergency response vehicles. So we had these vehicles that are designed to support large-scale mass casualty incidents. We have logistical support units that are designed to support these major incidents. And for whatever reason, I decided that week it wasn't required of me, but we were going to spend those overnight shifts inspecting these vehicles and checking them out for levels of readiness. That's one in the background. That's the old, it was called MERV 3 out of Brooklyn.
Yeah.
So at any rate, so we started doing that. That was Saturday night. Sunday night. Monday morning, we went to headquarters and picked up our brand new car. And we were excited, and everything was great. And we spent time, of course, putting all our equipment in, because basically a chief officer lives in his car, and his or her car. And so we put all our stuff in, set all our equipment up, etc., and waxed polished the wheels and waxed the tires and did all those things that make it look great. And we were ready to work. So then Monday night we came to work. Tuesday morning we're heading home, the end of our shift. We had stayed for a little bit of a late meeting at our headquarters, and on the way home, listening to the radio, and still in the car, and we heard the first report on police SOD on the Special Operations channel of a plane into the Trade Center. So at that point in time, it's just barely a little bit after 8 a.m. in the morning. I was the only chief on the radio at that point, still coming off of my overnight shift. And I said to Mary, let's go, turn it around. So we spun our car around and we headed for the Battery Tunnel. And that was how it started. Do you want to ask questions, or do you want me to go
No,
first?
I'll. This is your story. I'll let you tell it. I'm not going to interrupt.
So we responded. We were pretty much on the eastern end of Brooklyn when we heard that call. We responded in through Brooklyn. Again, it's interesting how things build on other things, but the years of learning ways to get around the city, not getting caught up in the traffic jams, etc. So we knew getting up on the Prospect Expressway or getting on the highway BQE heading toward Lower Manhattan would be a mess. So we didn't go that way. We took the side streets and went down to the tunnel and went in through the tunnel. And what was extraordinary about that, well, first of all, she's driving and I'm giving some direction. I'm talking to our citywide tour commander and communications. We're starting to mobilize resources. At this point in time, again, our thought is, until we got close, my thought is small plane. This is a problem, not a catastrophe, just a problem, something that we deal with. This is what we do. We respond to these emergencies and we manage them. That's what we do. So we started organizing task forces or groups of ambulances and EMS resources from the outlying boroughs to bring them closer to the bridges and tunnels, not knowing what we would need, but at least we're mobilized so that if we needed to bring resources in, they would get there quickly. So I'm giving direction on that. I'm talking to the tour commanders. I called my boss who was in his office. I said, you better head out for the World Trade Center, Chief Kowalczyk. And then we headed into the tunnel. As we're coming through Brooklyn, we're looking at the tower, and we could see one tower with smoke and some fire from it. And it was pretty clear. It was one tower is on fire. We went into the tunnel, got stuck in some traffic in the tunnel, although it was just emergency vehicles, but it wasn't moving for a few minutes. And in the tunnel, we had no communication. When we came out of the tunnel, it was a different scenario. And it was, they talk about the fog of war. You've heard this expression where you're trying to sort of sort out sets of facts, things that you're seeing or experiencing and not really knowing. It's not making sense to you. Well, this is the first thing that's not making sense to me. As I said, when we went into the tower, when we went into the tunnel, there was one tower burning, but now it's the other tower burning. I don't understand. It doesn't make sense to me what's happening. What we didn't realize, of course, is while we were in the tunnel, the second aircraft hit. So we make our way down West Street, find what we thought was a reasonably good place to park our brand new car, got out of the car, put on our equipment, our personal protective equipment, took our incident command tools with us and went down to the front of the Trade Center where the command post was set up. Met with Chief Gansey, rest in peace, who was the incident commander at the time. Spoke with Chief Gambo, who was the EMS incident commander, the medical branch director. He was inside the North Tower. And we started setting up our command post and getting accountability. So I was the second EMS chief on the scene of that incident. We start getting information, getting accountability, starting to understand what's going on here. And what was strange was as I looked up at the towers burning, and in one sense I said, your mind is always pattern matching, right? You're always trying to say, is this something I've seen before? Do I know how to do this? Have I done this before? This is just an unconscious process that a person goes through when they encounter something that seems new and unfamiliar, is to try and find some familiarity to it. So I'm looking and I see fire burning, and so my first thought was, okay, well, we've been here before. I was there in '93, right? We've seen smoke coming from the top of this building and glass breaking out and stuff like that. And then pretty quickly it became clear that this was nothing like that at all. And there was a lot of debris coming off the building. There were some bodies coming off the building. And then the chief called me on the radio and said, I want you to go into the South Tower, take command of the South Tower. I got the North Tower, you take the South Tower. So, okay. I said to Mary, pack up the stuff. We're going to the South Tower. And I start to step off the sidewalk, and suddenly she's screaming at me, Chief, stop. And, we're in a command post environment. We don't scream. We're supposed to be cool. We're professional, right? We don't get excited about these things. So right away, I'm like a little ticked that my aide would be screaming at a command post like that. And I stopped and I turned around and debris fell immediately in front of me, and she was seeing it. And I just wasn't seeing it. My mind was fixed on getting to the South Tower. So she fortunately saved me in that step that I didn't take. And we looked up and saw that there was too much debris coming off the building. It was not we would not have been able to make it across West Street. So I radioed back and said, we can't get to the South Tower from here, send somebody from the other side, which they did. Probably fortunate, because I think we might not have made it out of the South Tower if we had gone there. And so we instead got directed up to the corner of Liberty and West to set up our aid station there. So we took our equipment, went up there, gathered. There were 50 or 70 EMS people in the street there, a bunch of vehicles. Ambulances were staged well. They did a good job with that. And there were members in the street. There were a few patients, not a tremendous volume of patients at that point in that place, but there was debris starting to come off the building. So I gathered a couple of officers and said, all right, get everybody together, get everybody into the American Express building, which is across the street. Everybody undercover, away from the windows, get accountability so we know who's there. And let's set up a treatment area there. So the plan being, patients that we encounter, we'll bring them in there. They'll have some shelter. We'll have light. We'll be able to work on the patients. So they did that, got everybody clear of the street, and some minutes went by. And at that point, it's only Mary and myself are standing in the middle of the street. And, again, she had perception. She was doing the job of a chief's aide. She was watching out for our situational awareness while I was focusing on something else. And suddenly she said, Chief, run. And we look up, and actually, I think she said, my God, it's coming down. And we looked up, and it was coming down. And so we ran. And as she would tell you, don't ever hold the chief's hand when you're running, because she's faster than me. So we're running up the block, and I see an ambulance, doors wide open, back doors wide open. I think God sent that ambulance there for me. And I said, Mary, in here, but she was already way past that. So I fly into this ambulance and close the doors, and sat down there. And really, there was nowhere to go at that point. And the sky darkened, everything darkened, and we were just surrounded by clouds of debris. And I was hearing it hit the ambulance. And it was kind of strange, because there was no stretcher in the ambulance. The back was empty. There was starting to be dirt and dust coming into the vehicle, but all the doors were closed. And I said, how is this? What's going on? And I realized the cab windows were open in the front. So I sort of tried to crawl through the hatch, the little window that you can get through there. And it was not a city ambulance. It was a voluntary ambulance. I was able to get through, and I was able to power the windows up. Probably should have thought about driving that vehicle out of there, but by that time, that was not even a possibility. So anyway, I sat there and considered my options for survival, which was really not much more I could do at that point but pray, which I did. And after a couple of minutes, the radio was quiet. Everything was silent, just things hitting the truck. And after a couple of minutes, it lightened up a little bit. And then I heard her calling me on the radio, Chief, are you okay? Chief, where are you? And I responded and started to get a little lighter outside. And I said, where are the guys inside the building? We were right next door to the financial center. So she was up on the next block already. I said, stay there. I went into the financial center. And thank God, all of our members that we had taken out of the street were in there, were accounted for. Everybody was safe, which was great. And then we started getting reports of who was missing and who we couldn't find and who we couldn't account for on the radio. And honestly, nobody really knew what happened. Obviously, something collapsed, but we didn't know, we had no idea, couldn't see anything. If you were watching TV, you had a much better idea what was going on. We had no idea what happened, only that we lost communications. We can't find people. We had patients. There's a lot going on. So I ordered the entire team to pack everything up and move out of there. And we moved up the block to North End Avenue to a hotel there and reset up our treatment area there. So we're a block away, try and get some sense of what's going on. We're busy, we're treating patients. And Mary and I and a couple of other chiefs grouped over there were standing outside, and she says, Chief, I hear it. Something else is going to happen. And I was like, try to stay calm. And she's like, no, we got to go inside. And we did. And that was when the second tower came down. It's very hard to describe our feelings at that point. We knew, obviously, we've lost many, we've lost much, and basically felt like we had been defeated in a war. That's how I felt. And so a few of us chiefs who were there gathered and said, all right, what's our plan of action? So we determined that we were going to set up distance staging areas, mobilize resources from outside the city and try to establish communications and get some situational sense of what's going on. And so we worked at that for a while. My assignment was to go to, so we knew the city's Office of Emergency Management, which was in 7 World Trade Center, was, Embassy Hotel. You're right. Thank you, Jimmy. So my assignment was to go to the City Police Operations Center, which was formerly the city's Emergency Operations Center before OEM had been formed. It was on the 8th floor Police Plaza. So we sort of speculated that that's probably where the city would set up because it was close but not too close, and we knew that 7 World Trade Center was not accessible. So we went over there. We started walking in this dust and everything, and then we hitched a ride on a scooter that went by, and we're sort of hanging off the side of this and made our way with Chief Gombo to Police Emergency Operations Center, which was in fact where the city reestablished its EOC. And from there, we started giving some direction for this regional mobilization that took place. We directed staging areas to be set up at places like Yankee Stadium in Staten Island and the Brooklyn Navy Yard and Shea Stadium and Randall's Island. And started bringing in resources from outlying counties. And of course, at that point in time, pretty much anything we asked for, we got. So we called for some federal resources. And I think, again, a lot of the training and background that I had had in the years leading up to that, understanding what a real disaster response could look like, I think was very helpful because that was what we organized. And that was our response. At that point, of course, this is mid-afternoon on September 11th. We're thinking there's probably 10,000 patients that we're going to pull out of this building. Ha, ha, ha. We had no idea. So we were preparing for large-scale casualties. We were opening the Javits Center to set up a casualty collection point there, Brooklyn Navy Yard, the Yankee Stadium in Staten Island. And then as the day went into night, it became apparent that we're not going to need those casualty collection points, unfortunately. And so around 7 p.m., remember that we've been on since the night before. So around 7 p.m., we went out of there and just sort of sat on the steps of Police Plaza for an hour and tried to catch a nap. And then we went back to the scene and met up with the chiefs who were at the scene and started to organize our incident command system for this incident. So we determined that we were going to set up a major operation starting first light in the morning. There was no light in Manhattan. Manhattan was blacked out. One of these very surreal. I mean, the whole scene was just so bizarre. But Manhattan dark. You didn't, the normal humming noise of air conditioning units and vehicles and traffic. You heard nothing. There's no light. And so we set a plan in place. We had a temporary headquarters vehicle from some department in Jersey that came in on mutual aid with us. And so we set up an operation there. We developed a planning section, started putting an incident action plan together for the next morning. And I don't know why, but I agreed that we would stay on the overnight shift, and probably because I was assigned to the overnight shift that week, and other chiefs went to get some rest, and Mary and I stayed, and a couple of other chiefs stayed, and we did our planning and set up for the morning. And then the morning came, so this is now Wednesday morning. We've been up since Monday night. And so Wednesday morning, we went to go home. And we went looking for our car, our brand new car, and went to where I was sure we had put it. And we found the car, but it was toast, gone. Everything, car equipment is all gone. And it's just one more little problem in a day of many very large problems. It's just ironic, that's all. So we then hitchhiked with a supply truck back to headquarters, had to get a new vehicle arranged, finally got home. It was Wednesday afternoon. And then we were back there again, got about 8 hours of sleep and went back to the site. So that was a very difficult time. And it was, difficult is maybe the understatement of the year. That was a very, very tough, certainly toughest experience of my life. And I think in the lives of our city and many of us.
I remember talking to Lieutenant Jerry Sheehan, who that day was in charge of the NYPD bomb squad, and he lost one of his men, Detective. I mentioned him often on the show as tribute. Detective Claude Richards, who did not make it that day. He was killed in the collapse of the North Tower. The sixth member of the bomb squad in their history to die in the line of duty. And he said, I'll never forget him telling me this. Even if it's not your fault, and certainly wasn't his fault, you'll always feel partly responsible, and you never want to lose somebody under your watch in the line of duty. And EMS in total, separate from the FDNY, 8 EMTs were killed. But from the FDNY, Ricardo Quinn did not return home that day. Carlos Lilo did not return home that day. I don't know how well you knew those guys, but nevertheless, losing them, good men who went down there like every cop and fireman did, and EMS personnel did, to help people, to pay, and ultimately paying with their lives, particularly with their losses. How hard was it on you?
So, both of those gentlemen worked for me at various stations or in various commands. I knew them well, and there was a saying that I guess Chief Nigro perhaps said it. I just heard it repeated over time during the many funerals and morning services, memorial services that happened afterwards. And they said it wasn't just that we lost 343 people. We lost one person 343 times. And it's really sort of describes what that impact is. If you can describe something that's indescribable. I will tell you that we had weeks and months of following on funerals and memorial services, and it's a terribly difficult time. And at first you try, because this is our culture. You're going to go to all the funerals when you're off duty, and then it becomes just a lot. And then you say, all right, I'm just going to go to the funerals of people I know, or people I knew, or people I worked with, and then that becomes a lot. And then you say, all right, just the people that I really sort of knew. It was a very tough time. And I remember when they found Carlos's remains, and we were on duty, and we were called to the trade center, and they brought out the remains, and we had to make the notification to his wife, to his family, and probably one of the hardest experiences of my life. And I mean, this is months later. We knew he was not with us, but just going through that process was very, very difficult. So, and that was one person, 343 times. Excuse me.
If not for that day, and I always ask this to guys if by that point had enough time on the job and could have been eligible to retire, but maybe weren't thinking about it yet. If not for that, and then 2 months later with Flight 587, would you have called it a career? And even though you're not, sitting still in retirement, as we'll talk about briefly before we get to concluding segment, would you have called it a career anyway in October of 2002 from the FDNY as you did, or would you have kept going?
No, I loved the job. I loved what I was doing. And, my dad used to say, if you love what you do, you're never really working. And, I love what I did. And I mean, that was a very dark time in our city and in our job and in my life. But I love what I did. No, what happened was we continued on. Life went on. And in the fall of 2002, Mary, still my aide, came to me one day and said, Chief, you have to retire. And I said, why? You're not having fun anymore? And she said, no, look at this paperwork. And she showed me the paperwork. The city was offering a managerial buyout where basically they give you extra time, extra money buying out your time if you have a certain amount of years on. And I was eligible by a window of about 2 weeks. I fit into the slot that I was eligible. And at some point you get to a point where it doesn't pay financially to stay at work. You'd make more money doing something else and collecting that pension. And so I was blessed enough to fit into that window. So with very little forethought, because I had no plans to retire whatsoever, very little forethought, I put in my papers, and I haven't looked back since. I miss it every day. And of course, I'm very engaged in the field, emergency services every day. But financially, it was the right thing for my family and for me. So that's what I do.
one more question before I get to the concluding segment, and it's been a heck of a conversation with you, and I thank you for being here. We were talking about it off the air. You just mentioned it. You haven't been one of those guys to just retire. Not that there's anything wrong with this. Obviously, working in the PD, the FD, EMS, you earn it. You didn't just go to the beach. You didn't go down to Florida and just sit on the beach all day, drinking a Corona, watching the waves go by. You have been busy. You started this even before you retired. Incident Management Solutions started up in 1999. You were still active then. You've been a volunteer out on the island since 2004. You just started up a new job, and belated congratulations on that. I saw you post about it on LinkedIn. So you are busy with the capital B. What do you enjoy most about your work in the private sector?
Well, I love what I do. What I do is we as I did every day that I worked for the city, we help people who need assistance, who are in trouble, would be in trouble otherwise, and we're able to assist them and keep them out of trouble or keep them out of harm's way. So I did it as a paramedic in the street. I did it as a boss, as an officer, both for our patients and our colleagues. And I do that as a consultant. Incident Management Solutions is an emergency management consultancy. And what we do is we work with organizations like city agencies, government agencies, healthcare organizations, private businesses, airports, and we help them develop emergency plans, put test or exercise or train in their policies and procedures, be ready to respond to emergencies. And then in the event of an actual emergency, we provide support to their incident management teams. So I'm engaged in this all the time, and I love it because, like my dad said, if you love what you do, you're never really working. So, I'm not a golfer. I'm not a botanist. I'm not a person to plant flowers. My thumbs are black, can't grow anything. But if I can help people, I'm happy to do it. And I ride out with the Great Neck Vigilant Volunteer Fire Company. I ride out as a medic on their ambulances. In fact, I'm on shift in 3 hours. I love what I do. Happy to help people.
You haven't worked a day in your life since 1977.
Can you believe
it? 45 years, work free, baby. That's the life. That is the life. Of course, it is now time for the concluding segment, Rapid Fire. It's been a heck of a podcast. 5 hit-run questions from me as we always end. 5 hit-run answers from you. Are you ready? And you can say pass if you want.
Okay.
First, funniest colleagues you ever worked with?
Funniest colleagues. So I have to say, I worked with 3 wonderful, amazing aides, Frank McCartan, Eric Rodriguez, and Mary Merced. And I told you about how Mary kept me alive, which she really literally did. And Frank and Eric, these were the funniest people that I ever had a pleasure to work with. And I could just tell you stories about them, but they were just, when you're riding a shift with somebody, it can be horrible or it can be just a great time. And we worked, but we had a great time. And these were great, great people that I will always be indebted to.
Second, and we'll take it back to Woodstock 1994, because the question is, funniest call you ever responded to?
And that was in Woodstock. So one of these days, one of these muddy, rainy, nasty days in Woodstock, we're patrolling. We had a little golf cart gator kind of thing. We're going up a road. I was with another aide at the time. And someone calls me, help, can you help me? So I said, sure. What's up? And it was a young woman. And she said, I need to get inside your ambulance for a minute. Okay, so we called an ambulance over, and I said, well, what's the problem? And she said, something hurts me here. Okay, so where was here? Here was there. And what hurt was the clit ring that she had put in the night before in the mud in Woodstock, and there was completely inflamed. And, you just want to say, what were you thinking? What Yeah, that was one of the most bizarre calls. She went to the hospital on a big load of IV antibiotics. But
swing and a miss, and he struck him out. There you go. Third, most uplifting call you ever responded
to. So back in the 80s, I can't remember the exact date, but it had to be 1984 or maybe 1985, early 1985. A woman named Bridget Gurney was walking down the street in Manhattan on, I want to say it was 2nd Avenue. And she walked past a construction site where there was a crane operating into the pit of a building under construction. And as she walked past, this crane toppled over. And unfortunately, she was pinned between the crane and the wall of the pit, literally hanging by her leg in this pit with this crane over her. And I was the special ops officer on duty. We responded to that with a crew of medics, and I was the EMS commander for that incident. And she was pinned there quite in a very difficult position, very hard to get to, and we were not sure how we were going to get her out. In fact, there was a point in time where our plan B was get a surgeon and cut the leg to get her out, remove her leg, amputate it while she was pinned under the crane so that we could get her out. Fortunately, with a great job by fire rescue and PD emergency services, they were able to get enough of the crane moved away so that we were able to get her out. Paramedics went down into the on ropes down to her and were able to start IVs and stabilize her. We got her out with her leg, transported her to Bellevue Hospital, and she's able to walk again. She's still alive. She's still with us, as far as I know. And I think that was one of our best rescue success stories. Happy about that.
You probably saw, because I asked him about this when he was on the show, because he was a citywide lieutenant for ESU at the time. You probably saw my friend Al Baker there. He was there with emergency service at the time. Uh-huh. So, and he said the same thing. It was such an uplifting job for that reason. Against all odds, she survived.
Against all odds, she survived.
An amazing story. Fourth favorite bar or restaurant in New York City?
And that would be Peter Luger's, but the original one, the one in Williamsburg. That is the place. You want a steak and a nasty attitude, you go to Peter.
And on that note, fifth and finally, if you can grab anybody that just came out of the EMS Academy, given all their, all your experiences, I should say, what advice would you give them?
I would say, first of all, always put the patient first. Second of all, for yourself, look for every opportunity. There's so much training available now. A lot of it's free or not chargeable. Some of it you pay for, but it's well worth it. Take every opportunity you have to advance your career, move forward, expand your knowledge set, and just keep moving. Don't stop.
Stick around. Don't say goodbye. We'll say goodbye off the air, so stick around in the meantime. Any shout-outs you want to give to anyone or anything before I say goodbye to the audience?
Well, I would say always shout out to my beautiful daughters and to my beautiful granddaughter, who I don't know if she's watching, but maybe she'll see this one day. So I love you, girls.
That's nice. Hopefully, and thank you to them, of course. If you guys watched tonight, I hope I did a good job of interviewing your dad. Don't get mad at me if I didn't. I did my best. Anyway, shout out to you guys in the audience. Jimmy Scortis. Make sure I get to everybody here. Joe Murray, Russell Chapman is here as well. Bill Ryan, retired out of the NYPD Arson Explosion Squad. Marianne Pizzatola, Steven Soslavsky. I think I mentioned Joe Maliga. I'll mention you again, buddy. Steve-O and Nicholas Steve from the ATF, and Ruth Ann Griffin and Christian Williams. Thanks, guys, for tuning in to the Mike New Haven podcast tonight, volume 22, the best, the bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. Coming up next in the Mike New Haven podcast, big doubleheader on Tuesday. First, it's Charlie Gibson, the former Good Morning America anchor, as well as the anchor of World News Tonight. And the nightcap, it was a bomb plot. They were going to bomb the Atlantic Avenue subway on July 31st, 1997. And thanks to my friends in the emergency service unit and the bomb squad, it did not come to fruition. For volume 26 of Tales from the Boom Room, profiles of the NYPD's bomb squad, I'll be joined by the men who foiled the plot, Joe Dolan and Dave Martinez from ESU, Paul Yurko and Rich Teamson from the bomb squad, and Sergeant Fred Manzalillo from the Arson Explosion Squad, as we will revisit the 1997 Atlantic Avenue pipe bomb plot. In the meantime, on behalf of Zach Goldfarb, this has been volume 22, the best, the bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. I'm Mike Colón. Have a great weekend, and we will see you next time. Take care, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you.